Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Lionbird. This time we will continue our reading of The Demon Priest by Jim Burroughs. We left our young priest, William, also known as Whim, exploring the half-worlds to make sure that his godfather, the demon, is telling the truth. During the next several hours, Whim thought he managed to navigate the mores and complexities of taking a room for the night and obtaining meals before and after in the land of twilight without any sign that he'd given any more than the usual outlandish offense. Still, he was not quite certain of this. "Well done," said Walker as they left the inn. "Really? I thought I must have offended the innkeeper somehow." "Oh, why?" "Well, he was smiling a lot more when we arrived than just now." "Oh, quite the contrary. What you may have missed is that our host is a Brunning, bearkin, part carnivore. What you were seeing was that he was showing less teeth when we left than when he'd seen us first. That's a good thing among carnivores. The smiles were all friendly, but his initial unfamiliarity and suspicion had him baring more tooth. Call it a nervous gesture." "One that will now make me no more nervous if I notice it in future," quipped Whim. Walker smiled, almost showing tooth, and led Whim nightward into the forest. Having already adapted to the gentler light of twilight, Whim found that he adjusted fairly quickly to the moonlight filtering through the silvery canopy of the towering silverwood pines, the fragrant sable cedars, and the giant whispering oaks. For a while they followed a well-worn, broad wagon track through the woods. But after a few miles, Walker pointed out a path off to their right that Whim had failed to notice. The thick carpet of leaves and needles was barely disturbed, and the path at first appeared to be little more than the gap left by felicitous alignment of several trees. Once it was pointed out, though, Whim could make it out clearly. "Is that the hidden road?" he asked. "It's so easy to miss unless you stop to look for it." "No," replied Walker. "This is just a fairly normal fey path." "Normal as fey paths go." Walker chuckled. "Well, yes, you don't see them much back in mortal lands, but that's rather the point of this journey, isn't it? To see that the half-lands, that other realms and the folk in them are real, and that our friend's tales are true, that he is what he says and who he is." "Yes, it is." They paused then a short way down the fairy path and took out their water bottles. "And these, and the whey bread, all of the accoutrements and supplies. When I'm back home, if I still have them, then I'll know I didn't just dream this all." "True." "I don't suppose they'll still be ever full, nor the whey bread self-replenishing." "No, probably not unless you've some metahuman gift to drive them, or divine dispensation." "Now that would be scary." "Really? Great responsibility, as they say." Whim looked around. "It's really peaceful here, like taking a walk on a clear moonlit night. I hardly miss the colors. It's as if they would bring noise and chaos with them. Well, let's get going. Onward." They walked for an indeterminate time in silence, or rather the quiet noise of the woods, the leaves and needles crunching beneath their feet, the wind rustling the leaves, birds and small creatures chittering in the distance. They had stopped 4 times for water and twice for food, and Whim was beginning to long for at least a nap. Beyond that, he had no real sense of time in the eternal twilight. Walker paused, his hand held high, halting Whim, and listened intently. Placing a finger to his lips, he gestured for Whim to move from the path to a small thicket off to the side. As quietly as they could, the two took shelter among the bushes. Whim looked a question to Walker, who responded with a finger to the lips, followed by a gentle "wait" gesture. Soon Whim could hear the sound of someone or something, some ones or some things, coming toward them on the paths. Soon he could make out a cluster of dark figures coming their way, human figures, humanoid, and not very human at all, walking, shambling, creeping, and even slithering toward the point where they'd left the path just minutes before. The bushes obscured his view, but what Wim could see seemed suited to dream, or more properly nightmare. Shades and shadows walked and rode by. Moonlight glinted off scales and talons, weapons and harnesses. Several figures seemed to carry shadows and shrouds of dark mist with them. Soft, low voices grumbled and whispered menacingly. Wim hunkered down, grateful that he could barely make out their forms, hoping that the bushes fully concealed him from them. Once the foreboding figures had passed them by, they waited a couple of minutes and returned to the path. "Who or what were those?" asked Wim. "Forces loyal to She, who was once just so. I saw Night Gaunts, Lilim, Sirashim, and others no less troubling." "Do you think they're headed to Silverfish? Should we warn them?" "Yes, and yes." Walker rummaged through a pouch on his belt and pulled out a plain-looking, flattish, rounded stone. He held it in his palm, staring steadily at it for more than a minute, and then set it down on the edge of the path. Turning to Wim, he said, "Take my hand and jog beside me." "Okay." Wim complied, and after a dozen steps they passed into a region of mists that lasted only another dozen paces. When they emerged from the mists, it was on the verge of the woods around Silverfish that they had left, a day or so before. Walker found one of the obsidian-skinned warriors and appraised him of what they'd seen coming. The warrior thanked him and left to organize the town's defenses. "Should we stay to help?" asked Wim. "We could, but I believe that the militia and rangers can handle it. Given what the captain told us back on the Black, this sort of thing is likely to be a recurring problem. You can make it your fight, but if you do, you'll likely be away from mortal lands long enough that folk will see that you have aged during your weekend retreat." "I see. I don't like turning my back on people in need, but we came this way to keep from being embroiled in this same conflict at Twilight House." Wim sighed. "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. We have at least warned them." "As we should. But shall we now resume your journey?" asked Walker. "Yes," replied Wim. Joining hands, they trotted back through the mists, and in just a few dozen steps they were once more on the broad path through the wood of Twilight. Walker cast about, found the rounded stone, and returned it to his pouch. "I trust that our little side trip has not caused you to doubt that we are in fact really journeying through the Twilight realm on the outskirts of the actual Halflands?" "Somehow, no. If I'm deluded, it's pretty deeply." Wim sighed and continued, "Where to?" "Further down this path, though I'll confess that finding our way to the hidden road may have just become a harder task." "Oh?" "Yes. The powers that hide the road will have wanted to keep out the forces we just saw, and redoubled their efforts. Still, it is never easy." "Or else why call it the hidden road?" After several more hours walking deeper nightward, Walker signaled a stop. Quietly he studied the trees and the wood beyond them on both sides of the somewhat narrower path they had been traveling. He moved a little further along the path, and then appeared to find what he was looking for, a pair of extremely similar trees, like birches, with bark of silver and leaves the color of midnight. "Here," he proclaimed, "we leave the path here and proceed that way." He pointed in an oblique direction between the two trees. "Stay close to me." After about a dozen paces into the wood, the feel of the ground beneath their feet began to change, to harden, and soon they found themselves walking on cobblestones that glistened silver in the moonlight. "The hidden road," proclaimed Walker. "Is now a good time to ask, where will it take us?" replied Wim. "Into the dark reaches of the Nether realms, to where our friend Samuel spends much of his time. You asked originally about seeing where the demon wars occurred beyond their incursion into your Earth. Well, as you'll note, dark forces were moving down the forest road towards Silverfish, and we saw the dragons circling Twilight House. Without being close enough to be drawn into the actual warfare itself, the outskirts and verges of the Nether realms would seem the best way to determine the veracity of Samuel's tale. Wim nodded. Very well. I said that I would know what I was seeking once I saw it, and seeing her forces pass so close by, trembling at how close they were, running to take the alarm to Silverfish. Yes, that was part of it, but only part. Lead on. The hidden road led them nightward, and as it did, the terrain became darker, the vegetation thinner. The silver cobbles ran across rocky terrain and into at first a valley, and then, as the walls rose, a canyon. Wim could feel as much as see dark mountains rising up around them, a huge imposing boundary between twilight and the dark beyond. While the terrain rose, the road always seemed flat, if not descending. They stopped twice more for water and once for food. As they made their way down the hidden road, the feeling grew in Wim that he was not welcome here, that something did not want him here, and that he was being warned. Still, the more this foreboding grew, the more he was convinced that this was the way to what he sought. Dark mists rose around them. The moon seemed so distant, the light dimmer with each step. So, said Walker softly, breaking the silence as he paused upon the road, are you sure that you wish to continue into the dark? Wim's voice caught in his throat, and he whispered, Yes. Very well, said Walker, taking Wim by the elbow, and they continued into the mists. Just as the darkness threatened to become complete, they stepped out into a barren, rocky expanse upon the dark canyon's floor. The only light came from the silvery cobbles themselves, and a series of fiery brands ahead of them, slashes of fire in the dark depths before them. One grew as it approached them, and in its dim light it resolved itself into the form of a sword with a burning blade, a sword held in the hand of a dark-winged woman, a warrior woman off whose dark armor the fire's light gleamed. Her broad bat-like wings were extended out to her side, and she floated upright above the valley's floor, wings unmoving as she came toward them. She was not flying, but rather floated their way. As she approached, Wim could make out more details. She was a pale red figure clad in armor of black and gray metal. Her skin was a pale pink, a faded red, rather unlike the color of any human skin. Her bat-like wings were a darker, ruddy mauve, her hair dark red, her lips and eyes bright scarlet. The hand-and-a-half sword that she held was golden in color, with a crossguard in the shape of outstretched wings. Fire licked across the wavy blade. A ruby pendant hung about her neck. Stubby horns rose out of her forehead. You do not belong here, human. Turn back. At her words there was nothing that Wim wanted to do more than comply, yet somehow he stood his ground, staring into her alien, compelling eyes. Time passed. Who are you? Wim heard his voice ask softly in the echoing silence. I am Lelela, who watches the watchers, guards the guardians, and I say, go! William, priest and Bible scholar, just stared at the demonic figure before him. Layla, he said after a long silence. Layla of the Garden of Eden, wielding the sword of the Grigori? Her eyes bore into him. What do you think you know of me, priest? Only stories. Stories that tell of the angel Layla, who in the Garden of Eden first bestows wisdom and knowledge upon the unborn, then gifts them with forgetting and silence, laying her finger upon their lips, marking them with the philtrum, the indentation of the upper lip. That's what they say, at least. You humans, you forget no better than you learn, muddling it all, telling and retelling your stories until only fragments remain. Then perhaps you could better inform me? Lilela held the sword upright before her in the air and then released her grip. It did not fall, just hovered where she left it as she furled her wings and descended an invisible stair to stand before him. Yes, there is a garden, if you will, a place where life and spirit find their origins, a place of creation and nurturing, a place of spirit where, she gestured with spreading hands, powers, angels dwell, a place where life, spirits, minds emerge. What would you know of such a place and its inhabitants? I know one being, one who claims to have come from there, a Grigori, a watcher, whose stories say wielded a flaming sword while guarding the Garden of Eden before he fell from grace. Beyond that, and the stories of the psychopomp called Layla, which means night, very little. The Bible itself is silent on such things. It speaks of Adam and Eve and the temptation of the serpent. The rest are commentary, myths, and apocrypha. You have elements of the story, but as usual muddled. Many powers dwelt within, tending, nurturing, and guarding the garden. Your watchers watched over and guarded the garden and its paths. I nurtured, tended, and shaped the nascent spirits, readied them and set them on the path to your world of matter and energy. Then came the great corruption. Rebellious powers turned from their purpose, order faltered, strife racked the celestial world. After a time corruption was cast out, but it left its mark. Your watchers watched not only the celestial garden, but the world of matter, of spirit and flesh, and scores of them turned from their accustomed role, took flesh and entered the world. There they arrogated, assumed my role, and brought craft and knowledge, pushing the flourishing, the blooming, before its time. A proper garden grows in its own time, is tended, lies fallow, then flourishes, all in gentle rhythm. The fleshly world grew with a wild abandon of weeds, with no time to assimilate. The watchers having abandoned their role and taken from mine, I had no choice but to assume parts of theirs, to bear the sword, to guard and watch, to sow and reap rather than just tend and nurture. I watched not only the garden, but the earth and flesh, and upon a time it became clear there must be a paring back. A gardener must prune in order to control, to encourage the most beautiful flourishing. And so, for a time, I walked in the earth beyond the garden and cut back the wildest and most unruly. The greater powers, seeing the watchers in the world and what they had forced me to do, intervened. The watchers were bound and cast into another realm, a faint echo of that realm where the great rebels were confined, and I was set to guard their realm and watch their path. So, said William, on earth, something like... And Abram divided his troops, he and his servants, and with Layla he routed them and pursued them as far as Kova, which is on the left hand of Damascus. Not the way we usually translate Genesis, but it's in keeping with certain traditions. That is no more my concern. Like the great rebels and the fallen watchers, I have failed, and now my destiny is but to watch and guard, and you do not belong here. Why do you trouble me? I come because of that watcher that I know, to seek word of him, his mission, and his travels. Ah, you seek the one who departed, the preacher, who tells his tales of repentance and redemption, as if such a thing can have meaning for celestials. Huh! That would be him. My grandfather challenged him, as the story goes, and shrove him when he repented, baptized, and ordained him too. Nonsense! You are as mad as he. We are of the Spirit, not the flesh. For us there is only the absolute. We are not as flesh. The Layla held out her hand, and the flaming sword dropped down into it. Behind her, the myriad other brands came forward, and Whim could see that each was a sword in the hand of another Lalela. Soon they stretched out indefinitely to either side, a company of Lalelas. "Depart!" they demanded. Whim's head spun, his vision clouded, and when he could see straight again, he was standing with Walker at the crossroads of the hidden road and a woodland path, a path that seemed to be the one they had traveled from Silverfish. "That was it," he told Walker. "It? The confirmation I was looking for. I believe Uncle Samuel." Walker smiled. "And I have to admire his dedication if he's been trying to bring redemption to her sort for full 70. Then shall we make for home?" "Yes, please." And we'll return home and to the present day and find out what's going on at St. Michael's in New Acadia next time.